Okay, so I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1998, shortly before my 30th birthday. I was in a very manic swing at the time, then fell into a deep depression, then struggled for 4 years to get stable. Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo, and Me is my graphic memoir about that time. So it's my personal story, pretty much, but then I also fold in coping tools and therapies that I found along the way. Since it came out in 2012, I've heard from so many people who were thankful for the company and the information. And some of them told me that they used Marbles like a manual. A manual. You know, there's so much information that didn't get into Marbles, and then so much more information that I have found out since then, and then so much more information that I'd be interested in researching. So I decided, well, maybe we need a manual. And not just about getting stable, but about maintaining stability over the long term, which is just as challenging, frustrating, and essential. So when I was planning Rocksteady, I figured I would be kind of distributing my wisdom from my perch of 14 years of stability and the certainty that comes with that. But if I have gained any wisdom over these years, it's that the only constant is change, and stability is never a done deal. So a few months after I'd finished my proposal for Rocksteady, and I'm sorry, I keep looking over and saying, hi, it's Emily, right? Is that, oh, I'm sorry. You look like somebody that I know. Okay, so I had already started Rocksteady, and I had already started doing the research, and I had an appointment with my psychiatrist, and she had some bad news for me. So I got your labs, and your calcium level has been inching up. Lithium can affect a gland in your throat called the parathyroid, which regulates calcium. One of the effects of high calcium is depression. That's no good. So that's hypercalcemia, and hypercalcemia can cause other problems too, like osteoporosis and kidney stones. Well, so what are we going to do? Well, you'll have to come off of it. Off the lithium? Did I hear that right? Lithium has been one of my 2 mood stabilizers for all this time of stability. The other, lamotrigine, Lamictal, hadn't been enough on its own. So her news threw me into a tailspin. She and I talked about it for a long time, in person and on the phone. I did a lot of research on the internet. I turned to my support system, my friends, my partner, my mom, and I wrote and drew in my journal. The next medication we were going to try was oxcarbazepine. I resented oxcarbazepine. I drew a stupid ox in a stupid car. I just wanted to get organized and be extra deliberate about taking care of myself. You know, what I really wanted was a stability maintenance guide. And here I was already writing one. The timing really was uncanny. So I've had a chance to give it a personal test run. I learned a ton. It comforted me to be looking into it. I gained a lot of new coping tools myself. And I'm happy to say I do have an index. Yes. So 5 stars from me. So the big picture in Rocksteady is that it takes a lot of different kinds of coping tools and strategies to maintain stability. Things for everyday life, things for particular situations, and in a crisis. Sometimes it seems like the door to stability is locked. But there are some key elements, that help, and I have isolated 9. I will tell you them now. The first, foremost, sleep. Sleep, we need sleep for pretty much every mind and body process that you can think of, and more. And of course, that includes moods. Meds. So if you take meds, take your meds. Eat. So anybody who has ever had too much sugar or didn't get enough to eat and gets frazzled or had too much caffeine knows that what you eat affects your moods. And so I am putting forth that remember that what you put in your body is going to affect your moods. See your doctor or stick to whatever therapy is working for you. Meditation and mindfulness. Oh, meditation and mindfulness. Oh, we hear about this so much. But you know, it really helps. It helps a lot. When things are just getting frazzled and overwhelming, it allows you to kind of step outside of that and calm down and see like what's going on. And it helps you sleep. It helps you get to sleep. It helps you stay asleep. It helps for all sorts of things. Worth a try. Definitely worth considering. Exercise stimulates the anti-anxiety neurotransmitters in your brain. It helps regulate your appetite and helps you sleep. And once you're in practice, just like meditation and mindfulness, once you're in practice, it feels good. Feeling good, good for your body, good for your mind. Routine. So routine is one that I used to think it sounded so restrictive, like, don't box me in, it's non-creative. But it actually is much more complex than that. So there are a couple of different ways that I think of this. So one is really kind of logistical and remembering things. So for example, if you wake up every morning and you feed and walk your dog, then you're likely to remember to feed and walk your dog. And it's the same with all of the other things that we need to do to keep ourselves healthy. But routine actually is a lot more kind of poetic than that too. One of the things that I learned a ton about in researching this book is about circadian rhythms and just what that means. They're intense and they're really fascinating. I'm in the middle of reading another book about circadian rhythms now because it's so cool. But basically what it is that our bodies and the bodies and beings of pretty much everything in our ecosystem, all animals and plants, go by this cycle of light and dark and day and night. And it affects not just our sleep, which we generally think of with circadian rhythms, but also our rest when it is that our bodies are most alert and sleepy. It affects things like our grip strength. It pretty much affects everything. And it's connected to our retina, so that's where the light and dark and the day and night comes in. So it winds up being like this whole connection to the earth, which is pretty incredible. But another way to think of that kind of rhythm and keeping some kind of rhythm that way, if connection to the earth doesn't really, if you don't go for that, if you think of like a rock band, that would be Led Zeppelin for me. Okay, everybody, think of Led Zeppelin and a really solid rhythm section. So like Bonham and Jones, anyone? So a really solid rhythm section, it means that the lead guitar and all of the other everything that can go on can be as innovative and creative as can be, so long as this solid rhythm section is going on at the same time. So that's one way to think about routine, not as constricting, but as giving grounding to the rest of your creativity and innovation. Coping tools. Got a whole book of them. So this I figure you'll flipping through the book, or it looks like everybody has a book. This is basically, I think, if Batman were bipolar, this would be his utility build. And a solid support system, because it is just too much for one person to do by ourselves. Okay, So that's a lot of keys. So in thinking about, okay, so how am I going to bring this all together? So it seemed like every kind of therapy and skill had some sort of acronym or like cute mnemonic phrase to remember it. So I figured I was going to have one too. So the rock steady strategy is SMEDMERTS. Hooray! Sleep, meds, eat, doctor, mindfulness, exercise, routine, tools, support system, SMEDMERTS. Plus we have a mascot. So there were a few things that I wanted to make clear in Rocksteady. Well, there are a lot of things I wanted to make clear in Rocksteady, but there were a few that are really important to me. First and foremost is taking care of yourself is hard. It's hard. Even if you know all of the things that you should do. Sometimes we just get too busy and we have to figure out how to juggle priorities. And there are going to be plenty of times that we just mess up. And that's par for the course. And most of the time it'll be okay or fixable. So that is pretty much the most important thing to me. And then also, I wanted to make clear that taking care of yourself means coping tools like, keeping a mood chart and breathing exercises and that kind of thing. But it also means having ways to respect and be kind to yourself. And also ways to know for sure that you're not alone. I have a chapter in Rocksteady called You Have Company. And that's where you'll find the Mood Disorder Hall of Fame, for one. In Marbles, I included a lot of writers and artists through history who had mood disorders. And I know that, when I was writing Marbles, they kind of gave me company. And a lot of readers told me that was true for them too. So the Mood Disorder Hall of Fame is a bunch of contemporary figures, and there are 4 floors, and so it's actors and politicians and scientists, and this is the mezzanine of musicians. If you were listening to the playlist that was playing, all of those people have mood disorders. So all of them are on this floor. So Kid Cudi and Demi Lovato and Mary Lambert and more. And I want you to know that this as a tool, let's see. I made that playlist. Yay! I made that playlist. And it's a public playlist on Spotify, and it's called Rocksteady Hall of Fame. So here is a tool for you. So there is this out there, and music is so effective in it so affects your moods. I think that we've all cried to some things and been lifted by other things. It is very directly, studies show that it really affects your mood. So so there's that. There's also listening to it, you're not alone. And then also making a playlist. I really enjoyed it. I got the music that I really wanted to hear. It's a strategy too. So you can make your own playlist and have that queued up for when you need it. Okay. Another part of that chapter, You Are Not Alone, is about coming out. So as a way to find other people and also to accept yourself. So I'm going to read a little bit from that part. First, I'm going to take a sip of water. See my SMEDMERTS. If you get your book signed, you get a SMEDMERTS sticker. Ask the bipolar Ms. Manners. Dear bipolar Ms. Manners, what is the etiquette for telling someone you're dating that you have a mood disorder? Sincerely, totally love crazy. Dear TLC, I discussed this very question with sex advice expert Dan Savage on his Savage Lovecast. There are striking similarities with telling a new love interest about your kinks, i.e., telling someone something private and important that doesn't come up naturally in conversation. The following is my bipolar Ms. Manners' version of his advice. 1, be calm and sober, and ideally stable. 2, give your disclosure the time, space, and care it deserves. 3, it's fine to wait and get to know each other first. If you don't click, it's a moot point. 4, it's also okay to disclose right away if you want to vet them, but only if you're confident you'd be okay with a rejection. 5, let's say 2 to 5 dates. 6, do disclose before making any major commitments. And 7, a caution if you're feeling super high energy sexual. Okay, here's another pun. You ready? Entangling while manic can make for frayed knots. Sorry. Best wishes for getting the love you deserve. In solidarity, the bipolar Ms. Manners. Okay, and so I think I did say that you can know all of these things well and just have that all just kind of go to pieces in the moment. So all of these pieces of advice aside, I admit that I wasn't nearly so cautious when I met this one guy in Portland. So I met Jake in Portland in 2009, and I pursued him tirelessly for 3 days. Finally, he gave in. Note, 3 days, finally, right? Finally gave in, and I totally fell for him. So soon, late at night in my hotel room, he was in the shower, and I had a decision to make. Do I take my meds fast so he doesn't see and save that disclosure for some other time? Or do I wait and act like it's no big deal? Well, I couldn't decide quickly enough, and thus succeeded at neither. These are just, I'm bipolar. I suppose part of me just wanted to get it over with. If he's gonna bolt, best that he do it now. He was warm and understanding. No big deal. Remember, I went to art school. He was warm and understanding, as I know him to be. We've been together now for 9 years, actually 9 years next month. Thank you. And it's part of our origin story. So he gets the last lines. I admit it made me nervous. Not the bipolar part, the blurt part. Stability is an action. The title of this book, Rock Steady, those are both verbs. So to rock is to get off balance. To steady is to regain balance. It takes a lot of different kinds of coping tools and strategies to maintain stability in unstable times. So, like, if you are finding yourself getting really upset and things are getting overwhelming, maybe ask some friends for some extra support. If things are getting overwhelming and exciting, and it's summertime and it's getting really warm out and you're on a book tour and you have to deal with jet lag, make extra sure that you're getting enough sleep. Mind your smedmerts. Do your thing. Be brave, be well, and rock steady. Rock steady. Oops. Actually, this was supposed to be up there that time when I was talking. Rock steady.
So I'm going to start with the obvious question, which actually, when we talked about the obvious question, became a really interesting conversation, even though I always think of this as an obvious question, but why comics? Why would you put this kind of material into comics form instead of just making a text manual with lists and things that you could just dog ear and underline.
Well, the first answer and the easiest answer is I'm a cartoonist. This is my medium, and this is how it comes out. But I think just in general, I have a lot of feelings about the power of comics. And so many feelings about the power of comics. So it's in one simple way, there's a specificity to words that there's a specificity to words, and there's a certain kind of mood and abstract quality to art, to the art part of it. There's also the universal language of comics. The easiest part of that is like a word balloon, but there's also like arrows and panels, and if you think about like the Department of Transportation, like all of the visual language that we are used to all the time,
or even bathroom signs.
Yeah.
We know what that is.
Rub your hands with bubbles signs. So there's that. I think that in particular, for me, in dealing with something like mental illness, it allows me to say like very specific things. Lamictal, every day. This is how many things. Here's a list. Here's here is where, and then to have more of a mood and an intimacy, and the intimacy that comes from having it being hand done. For example, one of the things that we talked about. We talked on the phone. We actually Skyped. Yeah. We Skyped not that long ago, and we were going to have a quick conversation. I think it was like we were planning on like a 20-minute conversation. We talked for over an hour and a half.
Yeah, we did.
And one of the things that came up for me with Rocksteady is that there was it's a self-help guide. And so there's a lot of information that I wanted to get into words and pictures. And so words and pictures and the different ways that comics language manifests itself. And so the specificity of words, there are a lot of places that needed to be specific, and it's mostly words. And there are places that it made sense for it to be more integrated, and maybe even more on the art side, but most of it is really packed with information. So I was really just figuring out, with the primacy of the information, how it is that I could use the language of words and pictures.
Well, I also feel like your images really help convey the non-specific information that words alone can't explain, except for like taking up 2 paragraphs. Mm-hmm. So the image, is it up? So there's that image, right, of the balancing person who's balancing easily on the teeter-totter. And then there's the previous image that really shows like the dynamic chaos of balance. Right. And so, that we can like start to look at these metaphors as we're reading this text, I think also really helps to bring home like a physical experience of what balance involves and like what this type of thing does. And so I think you've really done a great job of helping to personalize and translate some of these concepts with that as well.
The seesaw is actually, it's an image that I got in my head a lot for maintaining balance. And it really kind of holds true in a lot of ways. Like how sometimes it feels like it's getting out, but the point really is to figure out how to compensate for different things.
And the other thing with the seesaw is that it's not you balancing against or with something else. It's you essentially responsible for that balance. Right. That, it's like there are a number of other things, other tools you can use, but you're the one who really has to kind of initiate that pressure and that shift in order to make the dynamic balance happen. Right.
And sometimes it feels like, for whatever, there's physics, but like things that like the more coping tools and solid support system, that like heavier it is, the easier it is then maybe to stay balanced in the middle. But one of the reasons that this one, where it's stable, like the whole idea that stability is an action,
Right.
that it's a constant compensating and not. I mean, I'm on my book tour. I got in yesterday and I'm dealing with jet lag. I mean, if I were doing my optimal, like there's no such thing as optimal, right? You know, because if you're going to live your life, and the whole idea is do your thing, live your life, and figure out how to be responsible about it. You know, go do some, you know, like that festival out in the woods, but get enough sleep, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No. So we'll just talk. It's okay. No. Are there any other images from this book or from Marbles that you are particularly proud of, or you know?
along these lines of visual metaphor, and that's another thing when I talk about the power of comics is visual metaphor. So like this, or I think that the one in Marbles that has struck home a lot for a lot of people is the Carousel for mood disorders. So I have on a page, you know, kind of a list of the different, you know, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 and major depression, and then to show the ways that those moods, what they're like. I have a carousel with the horses going up and down in different ways. And that is interesting, actually, in thinking about what kind of visual metaphors, where that comes from and how it works. Because originally I was going to draw a swing, you know, like mood swing, and these are all the different ways. But then I realized, you know, like that's kind of like back and forth in kind of an arc, and it didn't make sense.
And it's a single pathway.
It's a single pathway, and then it's like up needs to have a down.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, so what goes up and down in different ways, you know, like on a sort of like on a same kind of scale. And so that's where the carousel horses came from.
Yeah, it's also really interesting because it not only goes up and down, but it moves over time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's moving along a Y and an X-axis.
Right.
And that also makes it more dynamic and interesting.
Right.
And again, that gives us a physical, like we can have a physical response to that kind of image, especially the way you use the you know, like very high moments and the very low moments, and the figures are like being like thrown up by the, not vomited, but tossed in the air by the horse, sorry. Or like, or crushed by the horse. That there are other like dynamic ways to show the progression of mood, you know, and then make the horse itself like actually an actor in it instead of just a marker of place. So, yeah, it's a very dynamic, compelling image, I think.
Thanks, Kriota.
Sure, anytime, Ellen. I actually said to Ellen it was going to be hard for me to like have this conversation and just not go. And you know what else is really great about this book? Because there's a lot of really great stuff. So let's also talk about like why you personalized the book. Like a how-to manual, like my how-to manual is not personal. You know, it's like, and I don't like tell my own story. But can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to tell more of your story within this book? Well,
you know, there are a few different reasons. Why did I want to make this, like, give this a personal angle? So if you, it has a ton of information and some story. It's basically kind of like the flip of Marbles, which was my personal story with information folded in. This is a lot of information with some personal stories folded in. But then also all the way through, I have like little side notes, and I tried this, or I hated that, or you know, whatever. So there were a couple things. One, Marbles was really, really hard. It took so much energy and effort that when I was done, I was like, I am not doing anything else on bipolar disorder. I'm not going to do anything about me. The next one is going to be in third person, and it's going to be like squirrels on the moon, you know, or else it's just going to be third person. And I had some ideas that I started looking into, and then I just, you know, I think it took a little bit of time, and then I just came back to, I really feel like like I said, the kind of reader response that I got, and then just like a bit of time, like kind of coming back into feeling like there was more there, and how, what part 2 would be like stretching out into the future, and that, doesn't have much of a story arc, ideally,
Right.
and that really what the sequel would be, if, would be like a manual, like a self-help manual. And it made sense to me. And even still, I wasn't going to put myself into it, but my very perceptive agent who knows me well, Holly Bemis, she has managed to, like, well, you might think about several times in my career, and she's like, well, you might think about maybe putting a personal story, just a little vignette in the beginning of every chapter. And I was like, oh, I wasn't gonna put any, okay. And so I had those little vignettes and all this information, and I went away to writing residency, MacDowell, if anybody's been there. It's incredible. And I went there for 2 months, and I did the first draft. And it didn't take very long into putting it together that I realized that I have a lot of personal connection to this, that putting myself, I was ready to put myself into it, I guess, and that it was going to serve the book. Another thing, and a lot of different things that come into play. Also, in my research, almost all of the guides and advice are from therapists and PhDs and doctors, and they're really, even when they're wise, they're just, like, here is the thing that you should be doing. Right. And doesn't come from inside the experience at all. Right. None of that, like what I was saying, is really important to me, that, we're going to mess up. Like, or these are different for everybody. Right. Like, just like look at all the different medications that everybody's on. Like all the different kinds of treatments treatments. Like all of the different SMEDMERTS aspects are going to be different for everybody. And so I felt like that the subjectivity that I had to bring in, and my own just like, pick up this book and you have company, like right there, would be important, something important that I have to offer.
Right. Yeah, I think it also really, like, it kind of also shows that the book is not holding anyone to a standard. Like, you're not holding people to, like, you must do this and this will fix you and blah, blah, blah. Trust me, I'm a doctor, right, or whatever. It's like, instead you're like, no, you'll make mistakes. Trust me, I've made mistakes. Right. And so that, that also puts you in a really vulnerable position.
Most of the stories in here, the personal vignettes that I have in here, are me making mistakes.
So, but that also really puts you in a vulnerable position, in a way. So, and that also leads to the ideas around disclosure, like pros and cons of disclosure. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own decision to kind of just like let people know what was going on with you. And you were talking to me about, how when you were writing the book, you weren't really telling people what it was about. And I was wondering if you could tell them about that a little bit.
Well, what you were saying about the vulnerability and these stories, and the vulnerability that, like my own vulnerability that comes into play there, and my own coming out. And yeah, Marbles was my big coming out. It was exciting and terrifying to put that out. But one of the things that I have learned is, when Marbles came out, I really thought, one of the things I've learned is, but wait, is I thought that I was like opening up to vulnerability, and like everybody's going to think I'm weird, and I'm okay with that. But just how much company I got from that, and just how much people understood and would talk to me about their own experience, either their own personal experience of some sort of mental struggle or illness or in their family. It's so common and it's really close to everybody, and we don't really talk about it, like for secret reasons or for just because we don't have really a place to talk about them. And so one thing that I found really, really strongly is that by making myself vulnerable that way, it made me so much stronger. So I really feel like I can talk about it with a lot of grounding, and feel strong while doing that. So I feel like these stories of me messing up, while it can seem like that it's making me vulnerable in a way, I feel like I am strong enough to share those things.
Right. Yeah.
And in sharing them, like so many people already having posted this like a couple panels of the time that I accidentally took vitamin D instead of my mood stabilizer for 3 days. It's true. But then, like I called my doctor, so embarrassed, and managed to get back on track. And then it was because they were generics, and now I, learned my lesson and I mark my generics really well. And so that's the thing. It's like you mess up, you figure out what to do, you learn your lesson and go on. I mean, that's the, it's, yeah.
Yeah, and, going from the meds thing, I think the book is also really useful for people who just have chronic health conditions, who have to figure out how to, negotiate meds or stress, because a lot of health conditions are also dependent on stress, autoimmune disorders, other things. Were you thinking of this as kind of a general guideline for other people as well when you were making it, or were you really just kind of focusing on bipolar disorders?
Well, I decided to go ahead and focus on bipolar mood disorders with some focus on bipolar, but it became clear to me really quickly that a lot of these tools and strategies were going to be helpful for everybody. Anxiety is really, really common, and I would say that a lot of people are anxious right now, it seems. Certainly in my progressive world. When I was doing this book, and I was at McDowell, and and everybody was really, really super. It was the end of 2016. It was over the election, and so we were all in this beautiful bubble, really kind of not knowing what to do with ourselves.
Sure.
And I printed out a page from Marbles on alternate nostril breathing, which is very calming. And I put it in everyone's mailboxes. And a number of people came up to me. I can think of 5, but I think it might have been more than that, who came up to me afterwards and told me that they were doing it, and they were doing it a lot, and they found it really helpful. So, and then one of them started talking to me about her bipolar disorder. So, it brings, so many people are ready to talk about it if it comes out. But a lot of things are about calming, the coping tools, a lot of them are about calming, coming back into yourself. There's a whole chapter on insomnia. I had some conversations about insomnia there too. Being kind to yourself and valuing your own health. All of those things are relevant for everyone, really.
Yeah. I was really struck by that. Also, you mentioned the index. Yeah. This is another thing there's so much information here, and there are all these different ways to access it, and I just thought the way you put this together was very clever in that way. So if you can talk about your motivations for how you organize the material. Right.
There's an index. You have no idea how excited I am about that. There's an index. I wanted this book to really be useful, and part of that is being able to find the information that you need, and so just going to the, flipping through, and there's some markers like what art is nearby, but I wanted to have a lot of different ways. So there's the chapter of contents. There's they're called running footers, where along the bottom you know what chapter you're in. So if you're like, I know that it's in insomnia, you can find insomnia that way. You can, okay, so then there's the index. There's also on the back flap, there are some bookmarks that you can cut out and use those. Everybody has different ways of thinking and learning. I know that really well now that I'm like, bipolar, artist with bipolar, part of the disability community, right. and all the different ways that people look at things and understand things. So I wanted there to be a number of different ways that people could figure out how to get to the information. I mean, and comics. I mean, it also gets back to comics and comics as a way to people who are dyslexic have an easier time with comics. Often English as a second language. But I've heard from a number of people with bipolar in particular that it's the first book that they got through cover to cover. That Marbles was the first book that they got through cover to cover in a really long time. Because when you're having an episode, it's really often hard to concentrate, and so trying to find information that you need. And when you're using a manual, a lot of times it's when you need information. So I wanted to make it really easy for people to find stuff.
Yeah. It's and it is, which is also pretty great. I was also wondering if we could talk a little bit. Again, when we were Skyping, I cracked wise about how you couldn't be a poet in the 1800s without having tuberculosis. No one would take you seriously as a poet. And that there's a mystique about, having something going on with you in order to be a creative personality. So, but you seem to have embraced the idea that you can actually live a healthy lifestyle and still be a creative person. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that too.
Well, I think in some ways I feel like I'm lucky in that my case is pretty clear cut in a way, that when I'm manic, or when I've been manic in the past, because I haven't cycled in a long time, I would much rather clean my apartment and go out dancing, or dance in front of the mirror, or go do things than work on my stuff. And so actually, and then depressed, it was really hard to do much of anything. Certainly pretty or funny, as is my aim in my work. So stability has been really good for me that way. And then too, what I was talking about with routine, realizing that the kind of creativity that I can do now with a certain groundedness is actually a lot more interesting to me than the sort of the tubercular, I picture falling backwards on a canopy bed,
with a peasant blouse,
right? Yes, exactly.
It's and a quill,
right.
But there's creative thinker versus creative maker, and I think that there's that sometimes people confuse the idea of creative thought alone with creativity that can actually be shared with others. Mm-hmm. And so, you're kind of talking about finding that balance between, thinking, making, doing, and being able to, generate the ideas you have instead of just thinking them. So, and I'm going to have the last word on that because we should move into questions now. Okay. So, unless there's something else you wanted to. Okay. There. All right. Does anybody have any questions for Ellen? Ooh, there's one.
We have a limited amount of time for questions, so if everyone could exercise as much brevity as they can manage, that would be awesome. Here you go.
No pressure. Okay, I'd rather talk really fast. they're both process questions, but what, as a comics artist, do you can you share a little bit about your process? Like, do you script a lot and thumbnail? Like, how do you go about things? And I've always been super curious about what you use to ink things. If that's too comics nerdy, you can skip it. But yeah.
Comics nerdy, anyone? Arguments with comics nerdy? Okay.
Please answer that.
So my process, well, it's a little different when it's as research heavy as Rocksteady. I would say for the most part, I mean, I have a lot of stuff in journals, like lined paper. So there's a lot of writing. That's mostly like ideas gathering. And then I guess in general, you can just sort of like have a picture of me like with all of this information spread around and then just kind of like making sense of it. And some of that winds up being in simple pictures, but it's mostly it stays words for a while. When I was doing the writing residency, I wound up having a bulletin board that was divided into like I had all these different, but they were pieces of paper, like index cards with things written on them. Like, like this is where, like waking up in the middle of the night is going to go. And this is where, going to sleep is going to go. And here's that story and here's the whatever. So for the most part, it goes kind of like from gathering and scripting to thumbnailing, penciling. When it's something that's really long, this one, I wound up like kind of like having holes that got filled in later. So it's all done by hand until I get to pretty much scanning and inking, pencil inking. There's a lot by hand. The materials that I use, pencils and mechanical pencils with the twisty race, they're Pentel. If you haven't used them and you're like, what? Then look for that. And but a brush, a sable brush, and India ink on I can't remember the kind. It's not Bristol, but it's really, really super smooth too.
Vellum? No.
No, vellum has a bit of a tooth.
Oh, not the.
No, I don't know. I'm not going to come up with it. It's the special Paris. Some. It's not from Paris, but it's called Paris. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. If you can keep your hand up during a.
I'm pretty sure so I'm sure I know the answer to this, but is there any idea that you'll collaborate with other people to come up with more fantastic books for therapists to give to their patients? Ooh. For other psychopathologies, other kinds of like anxiety, depression, other types of disorders?
You mean
PTSD?
Would I cover other kinds of disorders? That's funny. I hadn't really thought about it. Well, because part of where I'm personally coming from is bipolar disorder. I did definitely feel like I wanted to open it up to mood disorders in general. More than I really had thought about in marbles, which I really kind of had bipolar disorder specifically, and so I wound up like widening my embrace in that, but I haven't thought about like doing it specifically for other disorders. That's interesting. Okay, all right. I look forward to hearing them.
All right.
Hi, so I know that you're not a doctor and that brains are very different, but I have something that I'm very curious about that's kind of like, I've talked to a lot of people about it and it's kind of hard to answer. I sort of have a mood disorder, but I'm kind of a lifelong victim of circumstance where it was like I was on meds because I was an angsty teen, and then I was on meds because I was like scared about my job, and now I'm okay. And I kind of don't want to take antidepressants forever, and I'm kind of don't really know where to go from there because like I've been okay for a while and I kind of know you need to like do the thing for a while before you can really not do it. But how I know this is not something that you would know necessarily, but how would you theoretically know if you could not take meds anymore?
Right. It's an excellent, excellent question. It really is. And you're right, I don't have the answer. Medications are so complicated. And I really think that there is a lot of over-medicating right now. And a lot of more long-term medication than needs to be long-term. So I guess what I would say mostly is find a doctor that you trust. And I know that that's hard too. It's so hard to figure out your path when the healthcare system is the way it is. So the reason that SMEDMERTS, like with the M, I always try to be really clear. If you take meds, take your meds. That it is not an essential part of being well. For a lot of people, it is. I believe that I need to take meds and that I will probably always need to take meds. But not everybody does. Not everybody needs to take meds forever. It might be something to talk about with your doctor, like if.
We've been talking for over a year about it.
But like some of it is self knowledge. Like do you have enough of a grip on your cycles, or to know like, oh, I'm interrupting people and I'm not sleeping quite as much. I need to take a PRN, an as needed medication, to kind of come back to stable. Like if at some point that's of the many answers, that would be one. Like, is there, if you want to try with your doctor, maybe not being on meds, but having something for sort of like a safety, so that you don't actually then cycle, and then then you can look at your like that kind of thing. It's really complicated. Yeah. No, it's an excellent question. I mean, meds, yeah, for sure. Meds, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Did you have some anxiety before Marbles came out about kind of revealing yourself to the world, to your students, as having bipolar disorder?
Yes. No, yes, for sure. No, yes, for sure. No, really. I felt like it was an important story for me to tell. It was important. It was an important story for me to get together, and I really had a sense that it was an important thing for me to tell. I was really pretty private about my disorder until then. I remember like getting lightheaded and kind of hyperventilating a little bit when I was telling in a small faculty meeting, so that before Marlboros came out, because I wanted them to know at my school. I was afraid like what the students were going to think, and what the world was if they were going to look at me differently, like, oh yeah, I remember that time she was at that party and she said that thing. She must have been crazy then. And so, yeah, I had a lot of anxiety around it. But, even before Marbles came out, when that period of time between when I had turned in the finals, and so that would have been like the beginning of 2012, and it came out in November, I realized in the interim, like, oh, I need to get used to talking about it, because I'm going to be talking about it a lot. And so it seemed like practically every time I would come out to someone, and come out meaning I wrote this book about my bipolar disorder. Actually, I had a line so that I memorized so that I could say it. What have I been working on? I've been working on a book about bipolar disorder. My bipolar disorder. It's a memoir. It's about what it's meant to me as an artist, and it also brings in writers and artists through history who had mood disorders, and studies that correlate mood disorders and creativity. So I would kind of come out and then keep talking and make it go farther and farther away from me. And so I had that line to say. But at that, I found really early on that people would start talking to me about their own personal experience. And so by the time Marbles came out, I kind of knew of the reaction that I would usually get. And it's only remained so or more so. So yes, and then kind of came out from there.
We have a little bit of time for one more question, if someone has one. I can take the last question. Can you give us a sneak peek into your next project? Is it actually squirrels on the moon?
Squirrels and giraffes on the moon.
Oh,
No, I've actually been thinking. I know we were talking about doing that together, but an English teacher friend of mine asked me when I was putting Marbles together, would you please make this available for teens? Like, would you make this a story that teens could? And I said, I really need to make it just how I need to do it how it needs to come out. And so when I was putting together Rocksteady, I mean, part of my proposal, part of my intent was to have it be also for teens. In the process of putting Rocksteady together, it became clear, actually in a 3-hour phone conversation with a psychologist, counselor at a high school, was a friend of a friend, that there were really different issues. There were things that, like on their parents' insurance. So like it can't be like, look at your list of insurance, like that. There's also substances. They're not legally able to make those decisions around drinking and smoking and anything else. It's a very different issue when you're a teen. And then also in particular, meds for teens. Like she and I talked about that for a long time because a lot of teenagers, most of my students are on medications, and their frontal lobes are still developing. When you're an adolescent, your brain is still developing. Very important parts of your brain are still developing until like your early 20s. And those are the parts that meds affect. And so it's tricky. There are some teens who benefit from it, for sure. I'm not saying that it's a bad idea across the board, but it's tricky. It's really tricky. And as tricky as it was to do Rocksteady and all of dealing with the medications, as tricky as that was for adults, I realized that I would need to treat it differently with teens. And so that's my roundabout way of saying that I am thinking about doing a book for teens, like with teens and for teens. And
Well, thank you both for coming and having this conversation with us. Let's give a round of applause for Ellen and Kriota.